constructor is run whenever a new instance is created of a class. Constructor is a kind of special method. It has the same name as the class. There may be more than one, because you could have 2 or 3 different constructors which would all have the same name as the class but could have different parameters in them. A method has a return type, but a constructor does not have any return type at all, not even void. And a constructor will get executed only once, whereas a method could get executed a lot of different times. Here's an example of the student results constructor. This is the default constructor. In other words, it's got no parameters in it at all. And it would be called by saying student results SR equals new student results. And you'll notice here there are no parameters. And that means that this one here is called because this agrees with this. And the main function of a constructor, as you can see here, is to initialize variables and get the object ready for first use. Constructors can also receive variables and store those as the default. So for example, if I want to create a new student results and I want to give it immediately its name and its grade in one brief call, then I can do it like this. And because this is a string followed by 2 strings, then it's going to look for a constructor which has a string and another string. It would be illegal for me to create a second constructor which had a string and followed by another string, even if I gave them different instance names. So this is the class definition, and here are the instance variables at the very top of the class. They're outside the scope of any method, and they're private. So they can't be accessed from outside the class, but they can be accessed from my constructor here. So in my constructor, I'm going to receive 3 variables, and I'm going to set the values here, the values of those variables, and they will take effect in the whole class. Now, perhaps if I want to clarify that I'm talking about instance variables here, a nice way to do it is to use the this keyword, this.rx equals whatever, this.ry equals whatever, and this.q q equals whatever. You'll see a little bit more on that later on. And this is, as I mentioned earlier, constructor overloading, when you have different constructors. Here are 2, and each of them has the same name, obviously, because they're constructors, but they have different variables. This one has no parameters. This one has 2 ints. Constructors can call other constructors. So what I might have is I might create a new complex, which is a class, and I'll not pass any variables into it at all. So it'll go here, but what it'll do is it'll call itself. It'll call its own constructor and pass in the 2 default variables, 2 default values. So it will call here now. Now the advantage of that is that I can put the bulk of the code inside this second one, and I can either say complex with no parameters, or I can say complex 1, 2, and either way this one will just temporarily jump to the default method, but this one will go here. So they'll both go through this function and they'll both use the same code. This is called constructor chaining, when one calls another. The keyword super is very handy as well, because if you have a class which extends another class, then the keyword super will call the constructor of the super class, in this case student results. So remember, constructors have the same name as the class but no return type. They don't even say void. They're almost always public. Now, to nitpick about this, if you want a constructor to be private or even protected, you can do that, but you'd only do it in very, very strange circumstance. For example, if you wanted a class not to be creatable from outside that class. Now, again, don't worry if you don't understand this, but if you wanted to have a class, for example, with a static method, which returned a new instance of that class, which is very similar to the singleton pattern, then you might be able to do it that way. But in general, constructors are always public. A constructor can be overloaded with different sets of variables. And when they call each other, that's called constructor chaining. And finally, the main job of a constructor is to get the object ready for its first use. And first of all, it can save a lot of lines of code by passing in all of the initial values of the variables in one line. But it can also be very, very useful, because if I take 5 or 6 lines to initialize all the variables in code, then those milliseconds that has taken, something else could have happened in that object in a multi-user environment. So it's a safe way of setting all the values in the variables before the first use of the object, before it becomes live. And finally, constructors are usually only called once. Well, they are only called once on the new keyword, unless they're chained, unless they call each other.